Hello, this is about how to make a bug applique. I'm using an applique to cover a hole in my jeans, but you can use appliques to decorate any fabric. First, I'm measuring the hole in my jeans, both in length and in width. I wasn't using a reference, but for beginners, I would suggest doing so and sketching on parchment paper so you can cut and trace it exactly like a real pattern. Including the separate pieces, cutting the head to be a separate piece from the body, from the wings, from the antennae. Your sketch doesn't have to be perfect. I often prefer to shape up the pieces cut from the sketch rather than making the sketch perfect and tracing that exactly. You can use empty space on an applique to embroider patterns, draw with fabric markers, or paint. I used a fabric with a pattern already because that's what I had. These are just some fun examples of different patterns that you could draw. Cut out your pattern approximately. Make sure it lines up if you're using it to cover a hole. Now select a fabric. I'm using a scrap from a shirt I cropped. I'm lining up how I want the pattern to be on the final applique. Make sure to minimize cutting edges of embroidery because it will unravel if you cut it. Cut first approximately, then trace on the wrong side of the fabric for a more precise cut. I was originally going to keep the antenna in green fabric, but I changed my mind later. Continue to make sure things line up as you cut the different pieces of fabric. Typically, I like to keep scraps like the ones you see here for stuffing different projects. So if you have a pillow that you're making, or you're making a stuffed animal, or if you're making an applique where you want a little bit of volume attached to it, those can make appliques much more texturally interesting when you add them to stuff. So it's really great to keep those scrap fabrics for that. I just keep mine in a little scrap jar with yarn and thread, scraps as well, just to minimize the waste. Now I'm choosing complementary fabrics. I considered texture and color. For repairs, you really don't want to use too heavy of fabric as it will weigh down the hole that's actually still there and further tear. It can also cause holes above the original hole from dragging down the fabric. Keep that in mind as you're selecting. Here, I'm marking guidelines to cut the triangle shape. You can also flip to the wrong side and mark on the fabric for clear cutting guides. For each piece you've cut, line it back up on the applique to make sure that it's coming out the way you want it to look. Now I've decided to take tulle and wrap it around the bug's body. This was to prevent as much fraying of the knit fabric as possible. It also gave the applique a stiffer appearance. I just folded the tulle around the green fabric and used a basic runner stitch. If you were using any other type of material, I would highly recommend pinning the fabric if you were to wrap one fabric with another. Tulle just has enough grip that it stays folded because of the friction with itself. As you go around, don't be afraid to bend and roll different parts of the fabric. This will help create a rounder shape and help keep the structural integrity. Occasionally with sewing, things will get tangled, such as here, especially with hand sewing. It's best to just take a deep breath and untangle it, and then continue. Now with each piece cut out, I arranged them to make sure it looked how I wanted. Take note of the layering, then sew down the bottom layer first. Removing the wings, looking at the layer below, taking note of what piece goes under which, and removing those top ones. Now sewing each of the pieces of the bottom layer down using a running stitch. Now moving on to the wings. I lined up the flower and cut it into a U-shaped arch. Then I folded it and cut it in half. I liked that it sort of looked like a butterfly. Double check and make sure your layers make sense for whatever you're sewing down next. Next, we're going to use a button stitch around the wing pieces to give them some structure and to ensure that they don't unravel. If you're working with a piece with embroidery on it, especially if it's knit like this, I would highly recommend fabric glue, particularly Phrase Stop. That way the little threads lay flat and don't tangle during your button stitching, and for some extra security against fraying. Complete the button stitching all the way around the wings. With them complete, lay them again, make sure you like how they look. Line up the pieces once more, then attach all the top layers using a runner stitch. Then pin 2 jeans and make sure they're truly in line to cover the hole. This is pretty much the finished product. You can attach it to anything. Here I'm attaching it to a pair of jeans. I am also using a runner stitch for this, but also back stitching as I go. This makes it much more durable for wear and washing. This is the bug all done.